Ruth chapter 2, verses 14 through 23 is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be in Ruth 2, but I want to look quickly at Luke chapter 10, New Testament passage, that has some correlation to what we're looking at today. It's a very familiar passage. It is the story of the Good Samaritan that Jesus shared. In Luke 10, verses 27 through 37, we find these words. And he answered and said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied and said, "A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers. And they stripped him and beat him, and went off, leaving him half dead. And by chance a certain priest was going down on the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. And a certain Samaritan who was on a journey came upon him, and when he saw him, he felt compassion, and came and took care of him. And the next day he took 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands?" And he said, "The one who showed mercy towards him." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same." Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is not just a story of loving your neighbor, but it is a story of loving those who are different than you. Loving those who might not be as lovable. In fact, loving those that you might not have much of an incentive to love. The Samaritans were not known as a good people. They were known for being dirty, rotten scoundrels in many ways. That's how the Jews viewed them. And yet that was the one who ended up being the good neighbor. It's a story of loving those we might not really want to have as neighbors. We're to love people whether they're easy to love or hard to love. The relatives of Ruth's dead husband may not have wanted to love her because she was a Moabite. And there's a little bit of a stigma with the Moabites, kind of like there was with the Samaritans. They were relatives, just like the Samaritans were relatives through Lot, but they were distant relatives who had turned away from the truths of God, just like the Samaritans had. A lot of parallels between the Samaritans and the Moabites. But there's also another reason why Abimelech's relatives, or Naomi's husband's relatives, may not have wanted to like Ruth. If Ruth ends up finding a husband in Bethlehem that's related to her husband who died, she will be able to raise up seed for that dead husband, and then that child will get an inheritance. I want you to put yourself in Boaz's shoes. If Ruth does not have a child through a relative of her deceased husband, Boaz isn't going to have to share land with that child. Because Boaz is a close relative, he would get part of that land if Naomi doesn't have a child. That's part of the significance of this whole story that a lot of people miss. Yes, Boaz is able to be one of those people that would marry Ruth and give a child to get the inheritance. But he doesn't have to be the one to marry her. If anyone marries her who's related close enough, he'll lose a future inheritance. The day of Jubilee would eventually come, and all the inheritance would go back to the original family. And that meant there's a chunk of land that had to be divided up between all the people that were part of that family group. And if Ruth has another child that's part of that family group, that means Boaz has to divide the land up to that child. Don't forget that as you're looking at this story. Knowing that, wouldn't it be in Boaz's best interest for Ruth to just go back to Moab? It really would. I want you to read this story with the realization that it is in Boaz's best financial interest, not his best godly interest. When you put God first, and you love the Lord and love your neighbor, all of a sudden what is your interest is lined up with God's interest. But if he's totally selfish and doesn't care about God, he's going to want Ruth to just leave. That's part of the story. This is such a wonderful story of a man who showed love because it was the right thing to do. Because we're going to find out Boaz really cares about God, cares about others, because he is a God-fearing man. Showing love means helping others, even when it costs you personally. That's the sort of people we ought to be as well. Let's bow for word. Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us as we look at this passage, as we understand the sacrificial love of Boaz. But Lord, help us also to remember your sacrificial love, to know that you are the best example of all of love. Lord, I think it is so beautiful that Boaz is part of the lineage of your human birth. To have somebody who showed love, to be the precursor to you showing such love, Lord. Help us not to forget the love you showed, but help us also to want to live in a similar way, to show love to others. In Jesus' name, amen. Boaz is being very kind to Ruth. Even though she has the potential to marry one of his kinsmen and take some of the land he would have inherited. Even if he married her, in other words, even if Boaz were to marry her and they were to have a child, that child would get part of his inheritance on the year of Jubilee. It'd be less for him to have, because that child would be allotted a certain portion. Now, if he's raising that child would probably work together with him and it would still be an advantage. But imagine if it's one of his cousins that marries Ruth. And maybe that cousin doesn't like him. And then they get more of the inheritance. You see how this might not be in Boaz's best financial interest? And imagine if he was a little bit unkind to Ruth. He wouldn't even have to be mean. He could just kind of ignore her. Make it a little bit inconvenient for her to hang around Bethlehem. And maybe she'd just decide to go back to Moab, and then he wouldn't have to worry about it. That's what a selfish person would do. You know how easy it is to be that kind of selfish person, though? To just ignore somebody else's needs because it's really not in our interest to help them. Boaz doesn't do that, though. In spite of the fact that his inheritance would be greater if Ruth wasn't around, or potentially be greater. Possible Ruth will stick around and never get married. But there's definitely that chance. Notice what he does. He invites her to keep gleaning in his field. Not only does he say you can keep gleaning here, he says, I'm going to make sure you're safe while you're here. You keep gleaning in my field with my maids, and I'm going to make sure you're protected. Besides that, I'm going to make sure you've got plenty of water while you're out here. Because it's going to be a work day. And while you're working out in the heat, you're going to need some water, and I'll provide you the water. He's making it very easy for her to stay and making her be very comfortable as she stays. Not only that, he invites her to join the workers for some food. I'm not sure if it's a full meal or if it's just a snack. But when it's time to eat, he says, hey, I'm going to share my food with you. Look at verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here, that you may eat of the bread and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar. So she sat beside the reapers and served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied and had some left. Some versions have vinegar, others have wine. Vinegar is just very similar to wine, but it's been fermented a little bit differently. I'm not sure what the proper translation is, to be perfectly honest with you. The whole point is it's something that was an effort to make, and it was a commodity that had value. Both wine and vinegar were commodities that had value, and he's sharing something of value with her. That's what love is about, sharing something of value. Love isn't just words, it's actions. And even though it may not be in Boaz's best interest to show love, he does. You see, showing love means helping others, even if it can cost you personally. Greater love hath no man than he lay down his life for his friends. That passage is in reference to Lord Jesus Christ giving his life for his friends. That cost him a lot. That's what love is. Love costs. You see, too often we equate the word love with romance. So, when I first met my wife, and she looked at me and smiled, and I noticed that, she smiled more than most girls smile. And I felt my heart go twitter. And I was nice to her just so I could get another smile. Okay, part of that was I wanted to be nice because she's a fellow human being, and I would have been nice to her anyway. But part of that was I was nice because I got something out of it. I got a smile. You see, it wasn't hard at all to show love to her because I was getting something in return that I really liked. I got that beautiful smile. But you know what? There's people that I have not found attractive at all that I showed love for. I remember being in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant years ago. I was early 20s, late teens, I can't remember. But some other kids about our age were there. We had the window rolled down the truck, and we were visiting, and we're talking with them, and just met them and getting to know them. And one of their friends was in the vehicle, and he'd been drinking a lot, and he was drunk, and he was a very large individual. Extremely overweight, and he was drunk. He decided to get out of the vehicle and come over and talk to us. He fell down on the ground. It had been raining, and he was in the mud, and he was gross. I believe he'd even thrown up because of his drunkenness. I didn't want to touch that kid. He was gross. And he needed help to get back up into the car. And I didn't want to touch him. How many of you like to go around puke? I mean, I really have a lot of trouble with my own nausea when that happens. But I had to show love for him. I had already been talking to his friends about Christ before this happened. Imagine if I didn't show love. It took supernatural help from God for me to touch that guy without puking myself. I helped him get back up, get into a seat, get into a safe place in the vehicle. He wasn't as pretty as my wife, I assure you. I didn't do it for the smiles. I did it because it's the right thing to do, and we ought to love our neighbors ourselves, even if they're unlovable. Love isn't just about loving those that are easy to love. It's about loving people who need love. Boaz does that. You know, it's possible Boaz thought Ruth was pretty. I don't know, it doesn't say that. I don't know if she was or she wasn't. We find out that another man was a closer relative, and there's no guarantee she would even marry him. If she was pretty, it's probably more likely she would marry one of his other relatives, if she was such a good catch. He'll relay that later. That he was surprised she'd even want to marry him. So let's just imagine she was pretty. He's still probably not expecting she'd even want to marry him. So what if she's pretty? He's a wealthy man. He probably could have had a lot of pretty girls interested, or pretty women interested in him. But he had already noticed her character, her caring for Naomi. Her love for others is what caught his attention. That shows that he's a godly man and wasn't just concerned about looks. He noticed she loved others, and he knows that's the right thing to do. And he does the right thing and shows love towards her. All of us ought to be living our lives in that way. Doing the right thing and showing love towards people, whether they're easy to love or not. By the way, if people are easy to love, show love towards them too. We should show love towards others regardless. Boaz is a godly man who values loving kindness towards others, and he continues to show kindness himself. Ruth chapter 2, verses 15 through 16. When she arose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. And also you shall purposely put out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Basically what he's doing is he's instructing his workers to be careless on purpose. Make sure you drop a little extra so she has a little extra to pick up. Notice what he's doing there? He's preserving her pride. She still gets to work for it, and he's making her work easy by letting it fall out, and then she finds it and picks it up. That's showing love as well. Not only is Boaz setting aside his own greed for land to help someone, he could end up taking a portion of his inheritance. But he's helping a Moabite. There's a history there. 400 years earlier, the Moabites had hired Balaam to curse Israel, and with the hope that they could be defeated so that the Moabites could have the land. When that didn't work, Balaam convinced them to intermarry and to get their spouses to lead them away from the true God. So the history of the Moabites is the history, for a man like Boaz, as he thinks back in the Moabites and their history, is the history of these Moabite women leading men away from God to take their land. I want you to think of that picture. When they think about the Moabite women, they're thinking of women who lead men away from God to take their land. Isn't that what Ruth really symbolizes? If she marries a man from Bethlehem who's a close relative of Boaz, she's going to take away the land just like they did 400 years ago. If you're a bigot at the time of Boaz, that's probably what you're thinking. And yet Boaz shows love and kindness. But think of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. He was the neighbor. The Good Samaritan was the neighbor. And we're to love our neighbors as ourselves. The history between the Samaritans and the Jews was very similar to the history between the Moabites and the Jews. You see, the problem with the Samaritans was they ended up marrying Gentiles and adopting a lot of the beliefs of the Gentiles while still holding on some of the beliefs of the Jews. They were half Jews that kind of halfway followed God. It was kind of the reputation of the Samaritans. That's essentially how the Jews viewed them, and it wasn't totally inaccurate. Very similar to what the Moabites had done in leading people away from God. But Boaz understands that Ruth, like the Good Samaritan, was a good neighbor. He recognized that she was a godly woman. The Samaritan was acting godly in Jesus' parable. And Ruth is acting godly in this situation. She's taking care of Naomi. He must love her, just like we're to love the Samaritan. Boaz must set aside greed. He must love God and love his neighbor. And we must as well. Although Ruth came from among a pagan people, she chose to love God and has shown love to her mother-in-law Naomi, and she's rewarded for it. By the way, there's a lot of people from foreign lands that are coming into our land. A lot of them are taking our tax dollars. Now, there's an issue of what's legal and what's not legal. I'm not saying people should do something that's illegal. But talking about what's legal and illegal is a reminder that we've all come short of the glory of God and sin is real. But we could still love those people as individuals. We could still reach out to them as our neighbors. We live in a world cursed by sin. Should it surprise us that there will be sinners amongst us? Well, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have a secure border. That's a whole other issue. We shouldn't even go that direction. The point I'm making is, if people are here, they're people. And let's not forget they're people. And let's not forget to love people. Don't forget that. Even if it costs you something. Love people. As we love God. Although Ruth came from among pagan people, she chose to love God and to love Naomi. And she's rewarded for it. Look at verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She gleaned until evening. She worked all day. That ephah of barley would be about the equivalent of 35 pounds. Imagine a 5-gallon pail full of wheat. That's what she ended up getting. Like the Good Samaritan, Ruth is willing to share what she has, and she brings it back to Naomi. Verses 18 and 19. And she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also took out and gave Naomi what she had left after she was satisfied. She took out what she had left after she was satisfied. That's talking about that morsel of bread that she was dipping and eating. She had leftovers. She wraps them up and brought it home, and she shares it with Naomi. Look what I got. She doesn't just hoard it for herself. That as well is great sacrifice. That's love. Naomi had no idea she had that. She could have kept it hidden. Naomi wouldn't even known. But she shared it. Sacrificial love is what we see here from so many people. That's what we ought to be living out. Notice the testimony we have as we live out that sacrificial love. People are recognizing that Ruth is a righteous woman. That she really does fear the true God. Her actions are showing that she's following the true God. She has a testimony in what she's doing for Naomi. But so does Boaz. Remember, he went to that field and he greeted his workers. And he's talking about God as he's greeting his workers. And then they greet him back and they're talking about God. So they are telling everybody, yeah, we follow God. But how many people have you heard talk about God but they don't live it? You're like, well, yeah, right, they're just hypocrites. Boaz and his servants don't look like hypocrites at all. They look like they're real. Because guess what? They are real. And that's how we ought to live our lives. We ought to be out among people, really living out love and speaking about who our God is and about His love. Because as people see our love for them and then we tell them about Jesus' love for them, they're going to say, oh, this makes sense. Now we understand why they're such a loving neighbor. Now we understand why they're so nice to us. Because they understand that Jesus was nice to them. And guess what? They'll start to think about how wonderful God really is. And they'll be appreciative of God if the Holy Spirit is really working in their hearts. Talk about God, but live out God as well. Be that good Samaritan. Be like Boaz and his servants. Be like Ruth with her kindness towards Naomi. But notice what Naomi says. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of the Lord who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. And again Naomi said to her, the man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives. Notice what Naomi is doing here as well. Naomi has been a follower of the true God way longer than what Ruth has. Naomi is in a position to be discipling Ruth, to be training Ruth about who the true God is. But notice what she does here. She says, blessed of the Lord be Boaz. She's talking about the Lord even as she's thankful for what Naomi is doing, or what Ruth is doing. We need to be talking about the Lord with the people around us. We need to find opportunities to bring the conversation back to God. Naomi is discipling Ruth in an informal way. They're not sitting down saying, let's open up to Genesis and have a study. But Ruth is hearing her mother-in-law talk about the Lord. And she's recognizing that God provides. And that God blesses. And that God uses people to bless. But the ultimate thankfulness goes back to God. So when you've done something nice to your neighbor, and they're appreciative of you, you have an opportunity to say, you need to be thanking God, not just thanking me. Because the reason I'm being nice to you is because I love God and I love you. And it points them to God. What an opportunity to disciple somebody in a very informal way, just by living out your life and talking about Christ. That's what Naomi is doing here for Ruth. That's what Boaz is doing for Ruth. And Ruth is learning the lessons and she's living them out. And she's being a testimony herself. Because Boaz was one of the closest relatives, he could raise up seed by bearing Ruth. He also could be very defensive, like Onan was in the Old Testament, and not want to share anything with them. The fact that someone who has so much to lose by Ruth being around has shown such loving kindness was a gift from God and showed that Boaz cared about and loved God as well. By the way, that makes it more likely that he'll be willing to actually raise up seed and not do like Onan did and prevent Ruth from becoming pregnant. Further, Naomi is understanding that this is not just a kindness to them, but also to her dead son. Because if Ruth is able to stay around Bethlehem and is able to meet a relative and marry him, then there is a chance for Naomi's son, who has passed away, to still have an heir through that grandson. So what she says is a kindness to both the living and dead. That's what she's talking about. She recognizes there's a chance for an heir, even though her sons are dead. It is clear that Boaz is doing the loving thing towards his neighbor Ruth. Then Ruth the Moabite, verse 21 says, Then Ruth the Moabitess said, Furthermore, he said to me, You shall stay close to my servants until they have finished all my harvest. Boaz is making sure that Ruth feels welcome in this strange land. He's making sure that she feels like she wants to stay. You see, he is welcoming the stranger in obedience to God's commands. What Boaz is doing there is exactly what Leviticus 19:34 teaches. Leviticus 19:34 says, The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So when that person asked Jesus, Who is my neighbor? Even the stranger who dwells among you, even the person who's way different than you are and isn't even a Jew, that's your neighbor who you show love to. And Boaz is doing that. He's obeying God. So what you see happening here is Boaz isn't just loving his neighbor, he's loving God by loving his neighbor. Naomi understands how gracious this act of kindness is, especially when she understands that not everyone in Israel was godly, as is evidenced by the next statement. Before we read this, let me just help you understand. Not everybody was like Boaz. There were some really ungodly people in Israel. There were people who didn't care about God. This is during the time of the judges, when they had a reputation for not living for God. Look at verses 22 and 23. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maids, lest others fall upon you in another field. In other words, she could go to another field and be treated terribly, cruelly. There are many ways people could have fallen upon her. They could have stole what she had gleaned, or they could have taken advantage of her. Verse 23, So she stayed close by the maids of Boaz in order to glean until the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest. And she lived with her mother-in-law. The point I'm making as I'm reading verses 22 and 23 is not everybody would have shown love in the way Boaz and his servants did. But Boaz and his servants didn't just talk about God, they lived for God. Imagine the testimony that had on the life of Ruth as a new believer. Seeing people who are really living for God and it's real in their lives. Imagine how much that strengthened her faith and helped her faith to grow. Boaz and Ruth both set wonderful examples of setting aside selfishness to love others. You see, both of their examples teach others more about God. As we faithfully serve Jesus, let us live our lives in such a manner that we're teaching others about God, both in action and in words. Let's strive to teach those who may not have grown up understanding the true God more about God. I want you to put that in the context of Ruth. Ruth did not grow up in a land where the true God was front and center. She grew up in a pagan land. In fact, her sister-in-law returned to following the other gods, while Ruth remained faithful and grew in her knowledge and understanding of God. You see, my job is to equip you for the work of the ministry. Your job is to do the work of the ministry, like Naomi, like Boaz's servants were doing. Boaz's servants were just servants who worked out in the field, and yet they're doing the work of the ministry. They're talking about God, and they're showing the love of God to those around them. That's how you do the work of the ministry. Live out the truth of God and talk about Him. And you will be making disciples. You may not even realize the full impact of what you're doing. But God's Word and God's truth doesn't return void. Be faithful like these people. I'm going to give you a few moments to reflect in prayer. After you've had a few moments to reflect in prayer, then I'll ask Rick to close us.